Hi, I'm Sharon Davis with the Home Baking Association, and I want you to welcome Lisa Fluff from Manhattan High School. Lisa's going to take time to share with us today why she said yes to FCS in her career and one favorite recipe she likes to teach her students. Lisa started her career as a baking science student at Kansas State University and graduated with a bakery science degree at Kansas State. She then opted for a master's in family and consumer sciences and now is a high school teacher. Lisa, tell us a little about your career as you go and show us how to make your favorite oatmeal raisin cookie.
I think a lot of students kind of take ownership and ask questions. I've gotten a question from a student on how do you make oatmeal raisin cookies not crumbly. So this is one way. It is in Lab 9 of your lab manual, talking about liquids. And what we're going to do is called conditioning your raisins. I think a lot of people think you just add your dried fruit into your recipe directly, but there's going to be an extra step in this recipe found from the lab manual. First, I have already done this. You can see in this Tupperware container right here. If you put all of your raisins in here according to the weight of your recipe or formula, weight is going to be a lot more accurate. I know a lot of people are more familiar with volume, but you're going to soak them in the tap water about 80 degrees and make sure you break up the clumps so that each individual raisin soaks up that liquid, and then you're going to let them sit here for about 5 to 10 minutes depending on how much liquid you want it to absorb. But how this is not going to make a crumbly raisin cookie is it's not going to take up all that moisture from the dough. The raisins are going to be hydrated, so then it's going to keep the raisins a little bit more moist, but also keep your dough moist. No boiling at all. Tap water directly from the sink works perfect, easy to do. And a new tip for your students to learn too. So I just have them draining after you set a timer for them soaking, and then you're ready to use them whenever it's time to put it in your mixer.
Great.
And you can see the water changes, so it's kind of absorbed some of that sugar and flavors too. In this bowl, I already have the butter and sugars combined. We're using softened butter. You want it room temperature just so that it fully incorporates. And this actually has granulated sugar and brown sugar in there. So you get kind of functionality from both, a little bit more moisture from the brown sugar. Then I'm going to add an egg and vanilla. It needs to be room temperature so you don't cause especially the butter and the fat to curdle. You want it nice and smooth, so you want to make sure you set those ahead of time. I've found sometimes you get really busy in school. If you get a bowl of warm water and set your egg in there, it can also help a little bit. But you have to make sure your butter and your eggs room temperature. For butter, you can put it in the microwave for about 5 seconds at a time, but do not have any of it melted and don't have it softer on the outside and then harder in the middle.
What happens if it's too soft? It won't do what?
If it's too soft, it's not going to grab that air incorporation, so you're not going to have the right consistency of your cookies, and it might cause them to spread more, which is also what you don't want. So it needs to be the right temperature, about 65 to 68 degrees if you want your students to temp it to kind of get an idea of how it should be. That works great too.
That butter stick can also be whacked with a rolling pin for a few minutes.
Yes.
And that will soften it. The main thing is it bendable? Is it pliable? That means it's soft enough to cream, but not puddly.
Yes,
right?
You do not want it puddled at all. Good. And I'm just mixing it, the vanilla and egg with the butter and sugars just until it's combined. You don't need to worry about incorporating too much air in cookies, but a little bit, just until it's all hydrated. Again, you want things thoroughly mixed. Have students scrape down the bowl. They might try to skip this step, but otherwise your cookie might have pockets that you're not going to want. And then when you actually scoop them up, it's not going to turn out the way you should. I'm going to mix it a little bit longer.
Can you overcream, Lisa?
Yes, you can overcream. If you add too much air into it, it's all going to collapse, and then it kind of wasted your time to even try to incorporate a little bit of air.
Will you see a difference in the spread if you've overcreamed?
Yeah.
The spread of the end cookie?
Yes, and that's going to affect, especially if you're thinking of packaging or the size of your cookies and making it, or different batches, you want to be consistent. Otherwise, it's going to throw your product off because you want consistency. That's very, very important. And then I just added the chemical leavening and some spices and the salt. So we have baking soda and baking powder as the chemical leavener, but I also have cinnamon, nutmeg, and salt in there. Usually when you're making cookies, you actually add it with your dry ingredients like flour. This one's going to be a little bit different. In oatmeal raisin, you have those oats, and you don't want it caught in those crevices. With chemical leavening, you want to make sure it's thoroughly combined all throughout, just so it's properly working, and it's actually really unpleasant to bite into a piece or chunk of chemical leavening, and it can kind of give a metallic taste on your tongue.
Which kind of chemical leavening did you use?
There's baking soda and baking powder. So baking powder has baking soda or sodium bicarbonate in it, but it also has an acid and a starch in there too. So don't use them interchangeably at all. So raisins have been sitting draining, but you're going to add them directly in. I also added the rest of the dry ingredients. There is all-purpose and whole wheat flour, so you get a little bit more nutrition. Kind of sneak it in, but kids will still like the cookies a lot. But you just want to do it just until it combines, and then the oats and the raisins. You don't want to tear up the raisins too much either, but you don't want a lot of gluten formation as well, because you want a nice tender soft cookie once you bite into it. So this looks pretty combined, but you want to make sure you scrape everything off.
So count that, 4 scrapes at least, I think, Lisa, and I know my students hated scraping too, but even around the edge of that bowl, if they just do that.
Yes, and it's worth it in the end. You don't want to get to the last couple cookies and then not have the right amount of ingredients, or maybe being too wet, or no raisins, or if you're making chocolate chip cookies, no chocolate chips in there.
Or they find the butter in the bottom of the bowl.
Yes, which is not fun, especially when it bakes. It'll just melt into a puddle.
Yeah.
But from here, we're going to use a portion scoop. When you are making cookies, especially if you're doing a bake sale or packaging them, you want consistency, all exactly the same size. You want them all to look alike, especially if you're packaging multiple in a bag. You want the same cookie also sold to every customer. What I like to, a lot of people will take their portion scoop and scrape the sides and then scoop it. I've found that a lot of students struggle with that even being more consistent, so you can take a straight edge like a butter knife and actually scrape it to the side too. Just be careful with the raisins and the oats on these cookies. There's a lot in there, but just making sure it is completely flat, and then putting it on your parchment lined pan. The parchment paper is going to protect your pan so that it lasts a little bit longer and nicer, and it'll help your students with cleanup, which they always enjoy as well.
Okay.
And make sure your students know ahead of time you do not need to spray the parchment paper. So I want to make sure that they're not going to have their cookies stick, but you do not need to spray your pan for cookies at all.
So would you say this is a top seller in a bake sale?
Yes, it really depends though on if people like raisins. This happens to be my dad's favorite type of cookie, but I do have students who are like, I don't want to make oatmeal raisin, I'd rather have chocolate chip. But some people really like that texture, extra flavor. From conditioning the raisins, I like the bite of it. You get a little bit more burst of a flavor from the hydrating as well. So
What's the scoop on how come you chose to be a teacher?
So, like it was kind of already mentioned, it started out with my love for baking at home, and then kind of got enhanced from the industry perspective from bakery science at K-State or Kansas State University. That was my undergraduate degree. But before I went to college, I was actually looking into teaching and kind of debating between teaching and the food industry, and I kind of figured out how to put both of my passions together. And I really love teaching baking, so this is a perfect job for me. And it's helped me kind of make those connections with the students, which the students kind of make it all worth it. And I love challenging myself and learning more for my students. And I think it's important you have to know who you're teaching though too before you get too much into content. So get to know your students, then they'll come to you and ask you questions like, how do I make this cake for my dad's birthday this weekend? And this is kind of how the oatmeal raisin cookie question came up to me too, with how do you make them not crumbly. So it works out really well.
That's great. Fabulous. Well, we hope you students out there will really take time to think about that. Say yes to FCS like Lisa has. We need teachers and we need FCCLA advisors. So let's think about that. I note one more thing, Lisa, and that is you space these. How far do you recommend a cookie this size? Is about a dozen?
These maybe 1.5 inches or 2 distance between them should be okay.
So let's give a shout out to the recipe source. It's in the Home Baking Association's lab manual called A Baker's Dozen, but it came from Kansas State University Extension. So thank you, Extension, and thank you, Lisa. Anything else you'd like to shout out to the students?
Say yes to FCS.
Thank you. homebaking.org